Lamentations ends with, essentially, you're not going to be angry with us forever, are you, God? It just kind of ends with, oh man, which is one of the reasons I love Lamentations, because it doesn't live or it doesn't end with, they lived happily ever after. And so I think that's a understandable question for people to wrestle with, because when you're in a long-term experience of pain or a really deep tragedy, you wrestle with, how does God's goodness and this moment, how do those go together?
Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. I've really been looking forward to today's conversation with Mark Vroegop, who is the new president of the Gospel Coalition. He's been the lead pastor of College Park Church in Indianapolis since 2008. And before that, he was pastor in Holland, Michigan. He has a daughter, 2 grandkids, 3 married sons. He and his wife, Sarah, do. And he's written several books. He's written Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament, and Weep With Me, How Lament Opens a Door for Racial Reconciliation. And he has a newer book as of June 2024 called Waiting Isn't a Waste, from Crossway. And the announcement just came down here a few weeks ago, as I'm recording this, Mark, that you would be the new president of the Gospel Coalition. And I'm wondering, when you think about this organization, started initially by Tim Keller and D.A. Carson and others, what do you think is different in church life and cultural life now than would have been the case when they started TGC?
What a question that is, right? And oh, how we all wish we knew the answer to that. That's the kind of question that you and I have been talking about, quite frankly, for the last couple of years. Like, what in the world is going on? So thanks for having me on your program, Russ. It's so great to see you. And, things are so different, aren't they? I mean, the dynamic of what it means to be together as brothers and sisters in Christ, that's gotten a lot more complicated. The issues that are in play that folks tend to agree upon or divide over, those are different. It's harder to be a pastor in our present environment. There's new risks, there's institutional distrust, there's understandable questioning of authority, even at every level, but especially with pastors and church leaders, and in many respects for good reason. So there's all kinds of challenges. And yet at the same time, I would say this is also an amazing time to be in gospel ministry. It's an amazing time to be persevering and resilient. It's an amazing time to find friends who can help you survive the crazy. And whenever the culture and the world and the challenges have been dark, it's an opportunity for the gospel to shine really, really clearly and really, really bright. So I'm optimistic, but it's not the same as what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, for that matter. But yet the gospel still is hope of the world. And I'm excited to see how God's going to use his word to change people's lives.
What is the gospel?
What is the gospel? There we go. Gospel is the good news that Jesus Christ came, died, was buried, raised again the third day, and offers forgiveness to those who put their trust in him, that they can be right with their creator and their God by having Christ's atonement pay for their sins. In a simple word and phrase, it's the way that Jesus changes people's lives from the inside out through his atonement and his death on the cross as we put faith in him.
I was talking, I've mentioned this before here, but I was talking several weeks ago with an atheist friend who said to me, I don't know why I should believe in God or in Christ any more than I believe in Santa Claus. How have you helped somebody like that to think through why you believe and why they should believe?
Well, yeah, I mean, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus and the gospel answers, frankly, the most important questions in life that are radically different than any other questions that we might ask. Questions like, how do I relate to the God who's created me? How do I deal with things that I know that I've done that are wrong? What is the means by which I can be forgiven? And how can my heart change from the inside out? And what's different about that understanding, that belief system, is that there's an implicit understanding, I think, within the heart of every human being, that that's a really important question. Now, we may have people who find different ways to answer that question, but that question is incredibly important for every person to answer. And the biblical message is that the answer for that is a relationship with Jesus and the way that he transforms our lives. And so, there's all kinds of things that people might claim that they believe, but belief in Jesus is different because it changes us fundamentally and it alters our understanding of who we are, our identity, and our relationship with our Creator. And in that respect, it's the most important question that anyone could answer, and it's found in the person and work of Christ.
Did you go through a time of unbelief and doubt at all, or were you reared in a Christian context?
By God's grace, I was raised in a wonderful Christian home, and I have a conversion story that was young and a call to ministry that happened at the exact same time. So I grew up never doubting that what I'm doing now, gospel ministry of some kind, was what I was going to do. And that call has been so strong and so clear that I've not wavered from it. Now, that said, all of us have doubts. We have seasons of difficulties. I've had a lot of hardship and suffering, and there's nothing like pain to make you question, is my faith really going to hold? And I think
Hmm.
actually one of the scariest things about long seasons of suffering, they don't feel survivable. And you even wonder, can my faith stand the test of this moment? And by God's grace, when you come through it, you see, oh, it can. But in those moments, it can be dark. It can be scary. I've described it like the dark side of the moon. There's like a gravitational orbit that's taking
Oh,
place. And when you're on the backside, it feels dark and cold and scary. But there's a providential orbit that's taking place there. And eventually you can, by God's grace, come out. But when you're in that moment, it can be frightening and it's real.
well, the gospel part of it. What about the coalition part? As you go to lead TGC, how how should we think through where to have broadness and where to have narrowness? So, I mean, I'm thinking John Wesley could not be part of the Gospel Coalition because he was not a Calvinist. But there are all kinds of differences on baptism and Lord's Supper and those kinds of things. So, how do you decide what ought to be? This is what we need in order to stand together. And these are the things that we differ on in our own churches, but we can work together. How do you differentiate between those things?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think it is an important one, and it's evolving and ever changing. Right, in every generation, you have to do the hard work of theological triage, which is one of the core things that are required in order to even be defined in Orthodox Christian. And then one of those things in the conviction circle that you believe strongly, and in some cases, churches define their membership by things of that sort. And you've got like first tier convictions and second tier convictions, and then you have preferences. And that distinction between those three sort of circles is really essential, because a legalist is somebody who takes a preference and treats it emotionally like it's an orthodox issue. But somebody who's losing what it means to have doctrinal fidelity is somebody who takes a core orthodox issue and then makes it a preference. And so I think the challenge is to figure out, how do we think about force ranking those? And I think every generation has to be able to do that and do that well. And the Gospel Coalition exists to renew and unify the contemporary church in the ancient gospel, to be able to get those core fundamental truths right, particularly in a reformed theological framework, And I think the genius of what Tim Keller and Don Carson put together was a set of foundation documents that defined the center, and then inviting those who affirm the center of that to be in relationship and to work together for the common cause of the advancement of the gospel. It doesn't mean that others who are outside of that particular coalition aren't following Jesus and aren't faithful brothers and sisters. But the Gospel Coalition has a particular aim to unify a particular segment within the broader framework of evangelical Christianity to try and address how do we speak the gospel in a way that's clear, that's helpful, and relates to the present issues that we're all dealing with in the context of our society. That's complicated, it's challenging, and yet it's really needed, because someone has once said that revival happens among friends, and the need to have relationships and people who you're laboring together is one of the important survival strategies when society and culture becomes more challenging to Christianity.
So if somebody's starting a church, you're planting a church, should that church make a particular view of election Calvinism versus Arminianism, or vice versa, or a particular view of complementarianism versus egalitarianism? Should those things be front door requirement of the church? Or is that something that, in terms of these alliances and kind of organic gatherings that happen outside the church, are appropriate?
Well, I think that's for each individual church to decide and to figure out what exactly do they want to do in terms of the specificity on how they handle those particular issues. And so, a church, I think, has the right to define its doctrinal statement as they want, to say these are the things that are required for membership in our church. But there are things even that are required for membership that don't define you necessarily as one person who's a Christian and another person isn't. So somebody may have a different view on a variety of things that are more on the convictional level, but it would be okay for a church to define their boundary marker in their local context in the way that would be most appropriate for their church, and really how they want to define themselves, and really have them as a church be unique, so to speak, in that community. And every generation has to figure that out. How do you do that? And what does that look like? Always guarding that the fence is too tight, and guarding that the fence is too loose. And that's a challenge to figure that out. Gospel Coalition exists for a particular mission and vision, and that is to be able to defend and apply the gospel in all of life, and particularly to do so in a context that's reformed theologically, complementarian in their framework, and a group of people who want to figure out how do we do life and ministry together in the context of relationship.
I'm trying to imagine going back and telling myself, at the first TGC conference I attended, in whatever year the first one was, back at the very beginning. But I'm trying to imagine saying to me or to you, in 2025, Mark Driscoll will be a Pentecostal. Josh Harris will be an atheist or an agnostic, or however he defines himself now. Tullian Chividjian, very well-known presence, would be however you would describe that situation. I mean, there are so many things that we never could have predicted. What what do you think makes the difference between the way one person responds to circumstances and somebody else? I mean, I have seen people who have gone through the exact same kind of situation and ended up, maybe they've come out of a really kind of abusive church. I've seen some people who end up being abusive leaders, and other people who end up being very sensitive and aware of the possibility of abuse, and or even better. I've seen people go through suffering and lose their faith, and sometimes people go through and strengthen their faith. What makes the difference between people in those categories? And how do you know?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think the best answer is, yeah, I don't think we actually know. I mean, if we all knew, we'd be
Yeah.
sure that never happens to us or
Hmm.
anyone that we know or love. So I think first of all, it just starts with a little bit of humble sobriety. Like it's not as easy as, well, it's this, and this. I think there are some things that are perhaps guardrails that can be set that just relate to the kind of environment that leaders are in, the kind of culture that leaders create around them, other friends who are able to sort of speak the truth into a brother's life at the right time. And I think also there's just a level of just of healthy humility of, man, I got to watch my soul, my life, my doctrine, and realize that this is really an important issue that I'm trying to be very sensitive to as I'm walking through life. I'm thinking of a question that somebody asked at a congregational meeting this last week. Somebody asked if our church is going through a search now for a new lead pastor, and somebody asked, like, does somebody come in and then they're on probation for a little bit? Like, how does that work? Like, at my job, they're on probation, and our chairman of elders wisely said, all of our pastors and all of our elders are always on probation. And I thought,
Mm, mm.
wow, that's a great way to think about it. That we got to watch our life and our doctrine closely. And that was helpful and exhorting. And I think it's wise for us to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Uh, So you're going to stay as pastor for a while until this process is over, and then what then?
Yeah, so my official start date of the Gospel Coalition is the 1st of March. So I'm in the process of transitioning right now. I'll remain at the church in Indianapolis as an elder, lay elder, and help in whatever way that I can in the next season of the church ministry, and to be sure that I'm sort of stay in my lane, so to speak. And that's something we've talked very openly and candidly about. And the thing is we love the church that we're in, and we can't imagine worshiping anywhere else. And when I considered this role, my wife said to me, is there any way that we could stay at our church? You know how deeply we love our church. And by God's grace, it's in a super healthy place. And so we're going to just be church members and an elder and be involved in the life of the body that we love so much.
There are many people who are trying to think through, how do I make a decision to go into a different job or ministry or calling or something else? How do I know when to do that, and how do I know when to keep doing what I'm doing? Now, in your case, it's not as drastic in many ways, because you are still going to be a pastor there at the church, but you had to make that decision. How does a person do that?
So that's really another great question that is really complicated, and it's a really important one. One, I think it relates that the totality of a person's life is interested in God's will every single day, as opposed to not being interested in God's will until you have to make a decision where there's a fork in the road. And so I think starting from a framework of every day, I want to do what God has called me to do, and being regularly aware of the importance of thinking those thoughts and being the best steward of the gifts that God has given me, looking at circumstances in life and thinking, what can I do to serve the Lord in my generation? That's a ongoing question. The second thing is to realize, I think, that our identity is so often overly rooted in what we do, that it's important for that identity to be rooted in who we are in Christ, so that jobs may change, but who we are in the Lord Jesus is the constant thing that remains, no matter what is taking place. And the reason that's important is because sometimes we can look at a decision and our identity is so connected to it that it sort of clouds our judgment. Another thing is just circumstances, passion, calling, fit. All of those things factor into looking at a situation and evaluating, is this wise? Does this seem to be a good fit for me, for my family? And you do all that work, and there's still a gap. No matter how much you research, no matter how much you look at it, no matter how much even you pray, there's, at least in my life, it's been true, there's still a gap. And it's like, well, I'm going to take this step by faith and trust that if the Lord's calling me, He's going to help me. And that's stressful. It can be challenging. And yet the Lord tells us that He's going to be with us as we walk in all kinds of decisions that he's never going to leave us. He's never going to abandon us. It's going to be okay, because at the end of the day, the Lord's going to be with us with every step that we take.
Yeah, because it seems there are some people who that gap get caught in a kind of paralysis because they're thinking, what if I make the wrong decision? Sometimes about a big decision. Where do I go to school, or who do I marry, or do I take this job or that job? And are just sort of in a kind of fear of making the wrong decision, which is a good and reasonable thing. we're supposed to be
Right.
we're supposed to be worried about the results of our decisions, but it can lead to just this sense of being in constant paralysis and not able to make a decision. So you're saying there comes a point where you just have to kind of take the plunge one way or the other and trust God.
Yeah, absolutely. And that doesn't take away from, doing test probes, if you will, maybe taking a half step to try something out to see if it's a good fit, being in relationships with folks who could tell you, hey, yeah, this seems to be a good fit for you. But at the end of the day, a lot of us are looking for completely risk-free decisions, absolute certainty that something's going to work out, the assurance that there's going to be no gap in this situation. If I could just pick up my phone and Google how to know God's will, and I could figure it out. Like, well, life just doesn't work like that. And I know it's by divine design, because it's been true in my life that those decisions have actually created a level of heartfelt dependency upon the Lord, where I know that John's gospel says, the Lord says, apart from me, you can do nothing. But in these moments when I'm living in a gap land, I feel I need literally the Lord's help as I'm praying through what to do and how to make this particular decision. And then at the end of the day, I just trust that my future is in God's control, and he knows far better. And I can look at my life. I'm 53, and I can see so many things as I look at my life. Wouldn't have seen the left turn, right turn, that relationship, the long-term effect, the beauty of what that decision actually resulted in. God's got a great track record with me that I can trust him.
Mm, mm. When you think about one of the reasons why I think a lot of people feel stuck is because they don't have relationships, or they feel as though they don't have close friendships. And that's, I think, especially true of men, seems right now, and maybe even extra especially true of people who are in ministry, because you there's a certain sense in which you can't be friends with the people you're leading and ministering to in the same way that you can't. And for a lot of pastors, they say to me, other pastors who actually understand what I'm going through, whether we like it or not, we tend to view each other as competitors when we're in the same place, even though we fight not to do that. But it keeps coming up. How do you do that? How do you keep yourself connected at a friendship level when you're leading and ministering and doing all these things?
Friends are really important. They're so life-giving, and when you're in pastoral ministry, it's just a little complicated. And I think just acknowledging that it's complicated is really helpful. I think one, there needs to be people who you're friends with who they don't give a rip about what you write, what you say. They love you because of who you are, and they are not impressed with any achievement. They're just friends. I think Drew Hunter, in his book on friendship, calls them covenant friends. They're friends because of something that's underneath everything else in life. And you don't have a lot of those. Most people don't have a lot of those in their lifetime. But when you find them, keeping them and preserving them, that's really, really important. Another level is there's always people in a church and pastoral ministry who there's an affinity with, a connection with, and pastors have to wisely discern and understand what do those relationships look like, and where is it that I can be myself and be real. And sometimes it's a little bit of a trial and error of trying to figure out what that's like. In my life, about 10 years or so ago, we have 37 elders at College Park Church. And I was like, that's great, because that helps us to shepherd the congregation. But that's really bad for me, because if it's 37 elders, then like, where do I go when I'm trying to wrestle with something? And so we created something that we call the lead pastor accountability team, which is three elders from the 37 that I meet with on a monthly basis, and they know what's going on in my soul, and they know what's taking place in the sort of the recesses of my mind and heart, in a place that I can um, just lay down. Here's what I'm wrestling with. Here's what's going on in my family, and here's some of the challenges that I'm thinking through. And I'll tell you, I had a breakfast, I think it was last week or so, with those guys who've been with me for quite a while. And the thought of not having them on a regular basis, like it has been, was emotional for all of us, because it's been a true joy and a delight. And even in my new role, trying to figure out what does that look like, and I'm starting to build that same kind of network, because I found that those kind of relationships, whether it's friends or folks who are in even the same organization who can just help provide support, like that's one of the survival strategies of resilience in our present challenging ministry environment. And it's been incredibly life-giving for me. I don't know what I'd do without those guys. I don't.
You've been pastoring for a lot of years. How has social media changed church life?
Not at all. It's been a great blessing and a huge add. I mean, that we can hear, that we can know what everyone thinks immediately, unfiltered. What a gift. No, oh man. Social media, has really made it challenging, because it does feel like we actually have given everyone in society a megaphone to say whatever, is on our minds. And in some cases, it's allowed in good ways for people to connect with one another. It's allowed voices that maybe wouldn't have been heard to be heard loud and clear. On the other side, it's made life really complicated. It's made people who are going on vacation not only a picture taker, not only someone who's going to share about their experience, but they have to be like their own PR agent while they're on vacation. They got to think about, what if I post a picture this way or that way? And as a result, we're not present. We're not in the moment. And as a result, even in church ministry, it makes things really, really challenging to know how do we navigate this space, and whose critique do we listen to carefully, and whose are we just like, I'm not even uh, gonna listen to that. So there's been a number of things that social media has been helpful with, but I think the net effect in our society and culture is really raised some questions about what it means when you give every human being a megaphone. You get an unfiltered view of what's really going on in the human heart, and the Bible says the heart is desperately wicked, and who could know it? And I think in our generation, we're like, well, yeah, we loud and clear, we see that, and you see it in that space.
Let's suppose you're making a decision, you and your elders, about when to have or to not have a service during Christmas. You're going to have the Sunday morning service, but not the Christmas Eve service, because where it falls, or vice versa, or what have you. And you start coming under social media lambasting for whatever decision you make. How do you interpret that? Do you look at it at all? And if you do, does that shape and change your decision? Does it put you in a place of kind of uncertainty? How do you sort through that? I think that's something that, 10 years ago, a certain kind of very, very high profile, as you are, pastor would have to deal with it. But now every pastor just about has to deal with that, even if it's just the neighborhood Facebook page going off on them. So how do you make those decisions?
Well, I'm still trying to figure that out, like so many people are. It's challenging, and it's not something that is just, well, this is the solution and this is what you do. I think a couple things that are important is just to realize that that's one data point. And so I don't think it can be just out of hand dismissed. So that's just social media. Well, social media represents real people. It represents image bearers, people who can have concerns. Some of the question would be: is this, concern or this issue people who are in my local church versus those who are just using the opportunity to make a comment or something of that sort. I think also it's important to remember that I think social media has a disproportionate attention grabber and a disproportionate volume to the actual number of people that are engaged and have that particular viewpoint and that opinion. So I think as a pastor, it's important to know that that's happening or know that that's there. Every pastor has to figure out how do they know that. I wouldn't recommend that pastor go trolling to find all of the comments and things of that sort, because it can really do violence to somebody's soul. At the same time, if you just completely hunker down and you have no concern whatsoever, I think that's also unwise. So I think it needs to be taken as a rather data point, and then just realize that the volume level is much louder in perception than it is in reality.
Why do so many of the meanest, most trollish profiles on social media have the word reformed in their bio?
Is that
What
true?
causes that? Yes.
Is it okay? I'll take your word for it. If that's true, you can see one of my strategies is not to go looking for that. Assuming that that's true, I think one thing that is historically true, and that is we have to be careful that when we're convictional and it's helpful in one space, that convictional thing can bleed over into other behaviors that are not helpful and in fact can be really destructive. And so, you have the back in the day, the strength of the fundamentalists who were convictional in terms of what their beliefs were about the fundamentals of the Christian faith, and then over time begin to be strong about everything, or somebody, or not everything, but strong about things that are of lesser importance. I think somebody has said that when you're a hammer, everything seems like a nail. And I think one of the strengths of the Reformed community and the strengths of Reformed theology is its desire and its application to be convictional and clear. And I think there's a caution to be sure that you're not convictional about everything and clear about everything in a way that isn't helpful and doesn't provide some measure of grace. So the folks that I think who do really well in that space, they know what their yes is, and they know what the order of importance is, and they're incredibly charitable, and they're not given to ungodly behavior because they feel this need to be right. And I think that's important for everyone, regardless of their theological background or kind of what space they operate in, to think through. Every strength has a shadow side, and that might be the case in that space as well.
I was talking one time to a young man who was coming out of a reformed church, reformed denomination, and he said, "I've seen so many Protestant churches and denominations do exactly what Catholic apologists said would happen, which is to continue to splinter and to continue to divide into other competing groups over what the Bible says or over some other reason." And he said that that's why he was becoming Roman Catholic. He wanted to have kind of an ancient stability there. I'm sure you've encountered young people who are thinking through, what about Roman Catholicism? What about Eastern Orthodoxy? Should I look for that kind of continuity and authority? How do you counsel people to think through that?
Well, I think it's a thing that is understandable that someone's longing for, which is that continuity, that stability. We all long for that, and we look for that in a variety of ways. I think the challenge with those particular church backgrounds is that you're able to receive that kind of stability, if you will, or that historic traditionalism. But when the gospel isn't clear, no matter how stable it feels, the true hope of life change and the true hope of forgiveness of sins and the true hope of what it means to be a follower of Jesus and faith alone by grace alone, that's the thing that changes people from the inside out. And so if you're just looking for the structure, that may be a temporary fix, but in the long run, the real life-giving change and stability is going to come from a heart that's transformed. And although structural things may feel like they provide that, in the long run, the real answer is a life-changing relationship with Jesus coming out of the gospel. So I understand why folks would long for that. I would just say they're actually longing for something even more foundational that can be found in gospel preaching churches.
This young man has said, I look around and don't see that much life change in the churches to which I have belonged from the outside world. And I hear that from a lot of young people who are, some not going toward Catholicism or Orthodoxy, some are deconstructing, and some are they just don't know what to do. But how do we see that change that happens with the new birth when it does seem like our churches aren't really that different, and in some cases are even more inflamed with the problems that people see on the outside?
Well, I think that's always been a problem with the church. That's not a new issue. There's always a church within the church, if you will, a group of people who are passionately following Jesus and experiencing life change. And while that may be true, that person's experience, um, I would wonder if it's true in every case. And maybe the sum total of it, the person would say it's subpar, and that could very well be true, that the collective godliness and the collective obedience to Jesus in a local assembly isn't great. And my encouragement would be, well, that doesn't mean that the church as a whole, then, as an entity, as the bride of Christ, is broken. It just means that there's broken people in the context of that church. And it may be that another church context would be more helpful and more life-giving to that individual. I just think that part of the beauty of the church is that she's always in process, because every human being is always in process. And I think we have to be careful not to cast too wide of a blanket or paint too wide of a stroke with a brush, if you will. That all churches are like that, or this whole church is like this. As tempting as that would be, there are pockets of godly behavior that we don't even know about, and there are people who are trying to follow Jesus really, really well. The key, I think, is to find who those people are and to connect your life to them and follow them as they follow Jesus, realizing that the church isn't going to be perfect until Jesus finally returns.
How does somebody find a mentor?
Mm. The best way to find a mentor is to be in a space where you hear someone talking and you see the product of their life and you think, that's somebody who is ahead of me. That's somebody who's godly. That's somebody who I'd actually like to know. And the best way to find a mentor is actually go to that person and say, could we have coffee? I just have some questions for you. I think the
Mm.
burden of mentoring is not on mentors, but on mentees. It's to find people who are ahead of us, asking the right questions, the kind of people whose lives we would want to emulate, and then spend any time that you can possibly spend with them. So I told a young man at my church about a year ago, what you need to do is go to that particular Sunday school class, because there's a host of people who I think would want to mentor. Sit, listen, and then when you hear somebody who gives an answer, the next week introduce yourself, get to know them, and as you develop that relationship, just inquire, would it be okay if I just grab coffee with you once a month, just to ask some questions? And then when you come to the meeting, that you're prepared. What are the things that you want to learn about? You as a mentee, you drive the conversation. And I think that's the best way to find a mentor. Mentoring programs can work, where you're trying to sign people. Those can work. Best thing, be in the space where there's godly people and find them, connect with them, meet them, and ask them if they'd be your mentor.
You talked about earlier about how your call to ministry and your conversion were very close together, and I had a similar experience. But I was in a church, and maybe you were too, where it would actually be brought up, not all the time, but regularly enough. Some of you might be called to ministry. I almost never hear that in a church context of any sort now. And I think in some ways, it maybe there was an overreaction to the idea, well, full time Christian service is everybody's called to full time Christian service. So there was a kind of uncomfortable pause in talking about you're being called to ministry. When you look at people who are, maybe adolescents or young adults, and they're looking at how difficult and hard ministry is, and they're saying, "I'm not sure who would want to have that life anyway." But then they're saying, I don't know if I have what it takes or if my calling is really a calling. How do you help them sort that out?
It's a great question because I do think that idea of like, in the back in the day, are you called and make a decision? And that's one way to do it. I don't think that's a good way to do it today for any number of reasons. And it may not even been a good way to do it back then. We could have another discussion about that. I think because of the unique challenges related to ministry, the best way for someone to both sense a call and know if they could be called is because they're connected to somebody relationally who is, that they understand that the beauty of what it means to be involved in ministry, specifically in my case, pastoral ministry, but they also understand the real world challenges. And then they know, and here's how you persevere through them. So somebody who can put some context in that. And I would say to people, look, I love pastoral ministry and you should be involved in pastoral ministry. And here's why pastoral ministry is hard, but here's also why it's glorious. You can't do that with just make a decision to follow Jesus into this. I think the complexity and the challenges related to ministry require a more discipleship based dynamic. And it also requires, I think, the testing of the person's not just their sense of calling, but even their gifting. And if the Spirit of God has given them the kind of gifts that could actually be surfacing now to say, actually, this could be something you could use in another context. In our own church, I think the last 3 pastors that we have hired have been people who have been raised up from within our church. And in many cases, they were guys who were serving, being faithful. And we thought, hey, have you ever thought about going into pastoral ministry? Because God's given you a unique gift in this space. And that was the means by which God called them. It was people in their life saying, God's gifted you. And what would you think about pursuing this full time? That's a different angle. And I actually think it's really important in our present age because of the different contours of what it means to be in pastoral ministry right now.
Are there any red flags that come up that would cause you to say, no, you should not. We do not need to proceed with this conversation about ministry.
Well, yeah, there are. And so there's some that are circumstantial, which, relate to um is being involved in maybe a teaching or preaching ministry. Do you see fruit from that? Because some people who would love to do that and they just don't have the gifting and they need somebody who loves them enough to say, you're really gifted, but in a lot of spaces, but not in this one. I remember having a conversation with one of our pastoral residents, and I said to him, "Look, you're one of the best number 2 guys I've ever met in my life. You shouldn't be a lead pastor, but you're going to change so many people's lives by being the best number 2 guy possible." And he embraced that, and to this day is serving in a really, really great context. But having someone who sees those gifts and then can maybe help them unpack it, I think is really, really important. Underneath that is a character issue, and there are some folks who just won't listen. They won't take feedback. They can't handle criticism. They're not humble. They're on an ego trip. Like all those red flags. Boom, 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 boom. Like and those are the folks who like, whoo, man, that pulpit moment or that pastoral ministry where you're helping people and you're speaking and interpreting the Bible, that can really go to a guy's head. And so you have to be really mindful and really uh, careful in the character domain. And that's why I think those discipleship relationships, local church contexts, people who know the person, like that stuff really, really matters to validate the sense of God's calling in someone's life.
One of the things that you have preached about and taught about, I think I heard you before I read you on this, but then read your work on this, is on lament. And I was just rereading last night Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking, about the year that she lost her husband. And she said, even though rationally I knew what happened, I kept thinking in my mind, I don't want to give his shoes away because he might come back.
Hmm.
And that's why she said it was magical thinking, and talked about how grief was so much harder for her than she ever imagined it would be. How does how does somebody who's going through a time of grief or suffering with all the kind of confusion that comes with that, how do you channel that into lament?
Well, one is knowing that lament's a category and that a third of the Psalms are laments. So a lot of people that I've run into have had the same experience that I have, which is a sorrow, a grief, a tragedy struck. And they just tried to talk to God through those sorrows. Like, I'm just trying to cling to what I believe and talk to God in a way that's honest. And then they learn about lament, what I define as a prayer in pain that leads to trust. And when they see it in the Bible and they hear it described, that it's a movement of turn, I'm going to talk to God in my pain. I'm going to complain. I'm going to tell him exactly what's wrong with the world, how I'm feeling. I'm going to ask for his help. I'm going to choose to trust. And then they see it like in Psalm 13, where it says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Suddenly people realize, wow, this is what's been going on in my soul. And there's a biblical language for it. So many people, when they're walking through grief and they're followers of Jesus, they know they should keep talking to God. They just don't know how to use the minor key language in the Bible. So when someone's going through sorrow and suffering and hardship, what lament does is lament gives us an opportunity to talk to God about what's really going on in our souls and avoid kind of the two ditches in Christianity, which is the ditch of denial. They come to church and people ask them, how you doing? They're like, well, everything's fine, praising the Lord. And inside they're dying because they think real Christians
Mhm.
don't struggle. Or the ditch of despair, which is, if I feel this way, it must be that I'm not even a Christian. If I have these doubts and these questions, I might, and maybe my faith won't even hold. What lament does is it goes right down the middle of those two ditches and says, here's a language for you to talk to God about your pain so you can choose to trust him. You turn, you lay out your pain, you complain, you ask, and you trust. And that's why I think when people discover lament, they see the grace of it, and then you see it not only all over the Psalms, but in many other places throughout the Bible. And you just realize God's given us a language to talk to him when life gets hard.
Do you think one of the reasons why we tend to fall into those ditches might be the way that we worship? And I'm thinking particularly, you've got a church, they're trying to think through, out of the best motives, how do we picture to people who maybe don't know Christ the joy and the freedom that comes in life in Christ? And so they emphasize those things to the detriment of lament and expressions of grief, to the point that people think, well, I mean, I must not be a Christian because I'm not as happy as these people are.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question because it relates not only to church, but also relates to Western culture, which is like the worst thing we could happen in Western culture is that we could be unhappy for a little bit, or we could have sorrow. And there's just this Western and Americanized version of that where I think we sometimes think that the goal is to always be positive and always encouraging. You know, like there's even some radio stations around the country. That's their theme, right? Positive and encouraging. And I'm sure from a marketing standpoint, it probably wouldn't work work if they were like somber and dark. Like that wouldn't work very well. But at the same time,
Grave.
yeah, at the same time, there's so many people in our churches. They come and we do generally triumphant. We do victory really well, and there's a bunch of people in the pews who are like, I'm not there at all. And so part of the thing that I think we have to work on, and by God's grace, coming out of COVID and the whole world sort of suffering, it's been remarkable since I published Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, the number of other voices that have stepped into the lament space, songwriters, things of that sort. I think it's important for us to just ask ourselves if we have a steady diet. If a third of the Psalms are laments, 1 out of 3, we may want to tip our congregational singing a bit and just think if we've got songs that reflect how a lot of our people may be feeling. Doesn't mean that every service needs to be like that, but and think even about pastoral prayers that reflect how do we talk to God collectively when life gets really hard. I felt when I was grieving, and even as a pastor, I felt this. I feel very lonely on Sundays. It seems like what everyone else is experiencing, I feel like I'm the only guy who's like not in this space, and that adds another layer to the complication of grief. And I've talked to a lot of people who are wrestling with that. Same time, I've talked to a lot of pastors who are trying to help get this lament language more into the regular fabric of liturgy and songs and preaching and pastoral prayers. I'm encouraged by that because I think this language is a grace that we need a lot more of.
And I think that there's been some real development in the area of worship toward this. I mean, if you think of the great hymn writers of our time, Keith and Kristen Getty, for instance, I mean, there's a lot of lament as well as joy and kind of full rounded in terms of speaking the way that God speaks. So it does seem that there are some positive directions toward that end. Don't you see that?
I do. And this has especially been true in the last 5 to 7 years. So, and I do think that the collective mourning of the whole global pandemic was actually strangely helpful in this space. And I talk with a number of pastors and also talk with songwriters about what it would look like to see this go even a little bit further. So I am deeply encouraged. When I wrote Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, I kind of jokingly said, I don't know if it's a good book, but it's about the only book on this particular subject. And now I can't say that anymore. There's a lot of really good folks who've stepped into that space. And I'm grateful because it's an important conversation that needs to continue.
There are some people who, when they go through these times of grief and lament, they can't help but feel as though maybe God is angry at them. Maybe God is telling them something through those experiences. How do you help somebody to think through that?
Well, the psalmist says pretty sharp words. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long must I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow all the day? Lamentations ends with, I mean, essentially, you're not going to be angry with us forever, are you, God? It just kind of ends with, oh man, which is one of the reasons I love Lamentations because it doesn't live or it doesn't end with, yeah, they lived happily ever after. And so I think that's a understandable question for people to wrestle with because when you're in a long-term experience of pain or a really deep tragedy, you wrestle with how does God's goodness and this moment, how do those go together? Is he angry with me? And the Bible is really clear that God doesn't do anything to his children out of a sense of anger and frustration. He uses all of these circumstances for our good and for his glory. And yet at the same time, there are things that are understandably hard and painful. And one of the lament psalms says, has God forgotten to be gracious? Will he withhold his steadfast love forever? And the reason I love those lament psalms is because they validate those questions, and yet the Bible also points us to the right conclusion, which is God is loving and kind and gracious. And it's just a matter of time until we see how that is going to be validated. It may not be until the new heavens and the new earth, but we're eventually going to know that God had goodness that was behind the dark clouds of our lives. So I think it's an important question to wrestle with. And then lament helps to lead us to coming to the right conclusion.
One of the things I hope you never have to lament is being stranded on a desert island by yourself for the rest of your life. But let's imagine you are. And one of the things we like to do at the close of the show here is to say, if you were stranded on a desert island for the rest of your life, you can't be very confident about your memory holding in this circumstance.
Okay.
You can only choose 5 books of the Bible to have with you for the rest of your life. What do you choose?
Psalms, Romans, Revelation, Hebrews, and it's going to be hard, so I'm going to go with Lamentations.
Mm-hmm.
Those would be my 5.
Mark Vroegop is the new president of the Gospel Coalition. He is the author of several books, including some books on lament that we've talked about, and I encourage you to check them out, including Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, and Weep with Me, as well as a book on waiting and patience. Mark, thanks for being with us today.
Russell, thanks for having me on.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Will Dawson. The associate producer is Mackenzie Hill. This episode was mixed by Kevin Morris with video production by Abby Egan. Theme music by Lennon Hutton. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.